Good evening, everyone. So glad you're joining us today for a lecture from Dr. Kang Lo James Hung.
You
And
can call me James.
thank you. Thank you, James. And these days, James is at the University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma Biological Survey, Oklahoma Natural Heritage Inventory. And but he's an alumnus of UC San Diego, and that's why we're all here today. Uh, It was 10 years ago today. I remember it like it was yesterday when we asked James if we could do an exhibit about his work as a PhD student at UC San Diego uh, with identifying and collecting and studying San Diego's native bees. And in the course of doing an exhibit with him, he gave us three very handsome specimen cases with some spectacular San Diego County native bees. And uh, when he gave them to us, James did ask, "Oh, now please take advantage of these and do outreach with these, and maybe you can actually loan them once in a while." And that's what we've been doing, James. I promise you. And we've taken very good care of those specimens. We're so proud to have them. And every springtime, we do put out a huge effort to make sure we do something. And this springtime, here it is. We started in 2014 doing it, and here it is, 2024. We decided we should ask you back. And in fact, you even gave a lecture for us on May 21st, 2014. So it's an anniversary of sorts.
It's a 10-year reunion.
Can you believe it? Can you believe it? And I just saw pictures of your children too, and it's like, wow, it really has been 10 years.
People
So
would not be able to tell just looking at the two of us, though.
thank you, thank you. You look great. Uh, so I should say that we're here having you speak for some extra reasons, but yes, our beginning our 10th year of outreach with those three wonderful specimen cases, but also it's we're getting ready for World Bee Day. Uh, the United Nations proclaimed May 20th as World Bee Day. And we've been doing our part, James, with your research. But now there's even more going on. When we were working together 10 years ago, there wasn't a World Bee Day yet. And we're a bee campus here at UC San Diego, and we're even a bee city here in San Diego. So there's many reasons to have a very nice exhibit that we have featuring your three cases, and a couple lectures to really, really be involved with World Bee Day. And you're the kickoff lecture, James, as well you should be. And I should tell people, there is one more lecture that if you live in San Diego, you should come on May 20th, and it features one of James' colleagues. But perhaps we'll talk more about that in a moment. In the meantime, James, thank you so much for being here with us. I, I'm I know you're doing great work at the Hung Pollinator Lab at the University of Oklahoma. I was just looking at your website, and there's so many bright, shiny faces in your lab. It's so nice to. They obviously are enjoying their work with you, and we really are so grateful that you're taking time out to talk with us today on an appropriate topic for this time of year, World Bee Day. Native bees in a changing world and how you can help. I think that's plenty of an introduction, James.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for your partnership and doing this bee outreach over the last 10 years. It's truly an honor to be invited back to give this lecture. I wish I could physically come over and be, with you all in San Diego. But thank goodness for technology and there being the option of coming to you via Zoom.
And now,
So,
James, I
yeah,
need to do some housekeeping before we started this.
sure.
I should probably tell people that I'm Scott Paulson, the president of the uh, James Hung Fan Club. But I work here at Geisel Library, and I'm an alumnus of the school, and I do the exhibits and some of the events here. And I'm so proud to have you here. And I should tell people that if they want to submit questions, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be doing it through the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. We've turned the chat feature off. So if you want to ask a question, you're going to type it into the Q&A feature. Also, today's program is being recorded, and we'll keep you posted about that. And if you want closed captioning, it is enabled. Well, we've enabled it anyway. You can go to the bottom of your screen and click closed captioning so that you can take advantage of that should you need it. That's the housekeeping I meant to do. Back to you, James.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much again for your very kind introduction and for inviting me back. So, as you could tell from my title slide, I'm going to talk about bees today. But before that, I'm just going to do a super fast refresher about why bees matter. So here's an energy pyramid of all terrestrial land-based ecosystems on Earth, where you can see the plants really are the only ones that can capture energy that comes from the sun, and also gases that are floating in our atmosphere, and then convert them to living molecules at the scale that's necessary to sustain all forms of terrestrial life we see, and also create the structure of the habitat that all land-based creatures need to live in. And so that's why pollinators are such a big deal, because plants have this problem of being rooted in the ground. They can't get up and move and find mates. And so, in order to reproduce, plants use the help of pollinators, which means that conceiving the next generation of plants literally requires the birds and the bees. And of course, the flies, the beetles, butterflies, moths, bats. Now, these are organisms that don't all look very much similar to one another. They span a very large range of the animal tree of life, and they have pretty diverse ways of life, but they're all bonded together by one thing in common, which is that they're all hungry for the rich and tasty foods that flowers offer. Oh, and another thing they have in common is that they all have the sensory acuity and also the mobility to zoom from one flower to another over a large landscape, which means that flowers are constantly competing for these mobile agents that act as chaperones for their reproductive work. So we have pollinators to thank, not only for moving pollen around to help plants reproduce and generate the habitat and the yummy fruits and seeds that many other animals rely on, but also for the fact that plants, in order to attract these pollinators, have adapted these very beautiful displays to compete against one another for the services of these pollinators. So flowers really are the plant's way of making bigger, brighter, louder advertisements to attract the attention of pollinators to come and enjoy their nectar and move their pollen around. And so that pollinators really are members of a gig economy. And although all these pollinators are up to the job and they're all suited to kind of their corner of the pollen and nectar free market, there's really one group that stands out, which are, of course, the bees, my favorite group. They may not be the most diverse group of pollinators. Flies, beetles, moths are much more diverse, and they may not be the biggest of all pollinators. There are many bat species and bird species that are orders of magnitude larger than bees, but they do come in very high numbers, and they do also have a life cycle that really intricately ties them to the flower of plants at all stages of their life. And so this is the group that we're celebrating today as the poster child for pollinators all over the world. So the first step in learning about bees is learning how to recognize one. So bees are classified by biologists as a group of vegetarian wasps that have lost their predatory lifestyles and have grown branched hairs on their bodies. So they're very fuzzy creatures. And if you look closely enough at a bee, as in through a microscope, you can see that somewhere on their body, they have some hairs that have branches on them, kind of like feathers or velvet. And they, as members of Hymenoptera, along with bees and along with wasps and ants, they have two pairs of wings, which they often carry folded over their backs when they're at rest. They have rod-like antennae, so antennae that are more like sausage links than whips or clubs. They have narrowed waists, which are an adaptation to allow their abdomens a greater range of motion to use their powerful stingers to defend themselves. And because they are heavily armed with that stinger, they have the luxury of being very flamboyant with their dress code. They often come with very striking, contrasting dark and light markings in order to warn their would-be predators to leave them alone, because any creature that's out flaunting themselves wide in the open generally means they have something that makes the predators not want to mess with them. They also have flattened hind legs, which in most species have a pollen brush that's used to carry pollen back to their nests. Now, since bees are classified as vegetarian wasps, of course, the insects that they're most commonly mistaken for are non-vegetarian wasps. And being closely related to bees, they have the same kind of sausage link antennae, they have the same narrowed waist and striking markings that signify that they also come armed with painful stingers. Like bees, they also have two pairs of wings, but in many groups of wasps, they carry them kind of like a fighter jet plane away from their back at some angle. And unlike bees, wasps are generally not very hairy. And even the ones that do have more body hair, they're never branched like the hairs of bees. They also don't have flattened hind legs. They have cylindrical legs for the most part, and that's because they don't need all that extra surface area to carry all these pollen brush hairs to carry pollen back to their home. And if you see an insect that may be a bee, maybe a wasp, but is carrying some sort of hapless insect or spider prey, that's a dead giveaway because bees are vegetarians. Now, of course, I mentioned earlier that bees and wasps are flamboyantly garbed because they have a means of defending themselves. Now, other insects that don't have the means of defending themselves, like bees or wasps, would benefit from stealing that look. So here is one example of a very clever very clever copycat disguise by a hoverfly. So unlike bees, flies only have a single pair of wings, which often they carry in a single flat plane across their back. So if you can get close enough to count how many wings the creature has, if you only count two, that's definitely a fly. Flies also have antennae that are unlike the sausage links of bees and wasps. In this example, you can see they're barely little stubs with a little bristle coming out of it. Flies also generally don't have flattened hind legs. They have other various kinds of modifications, but not these flat legs with pollen brushes on them. Now, everything I just said will help you get most of the way there when you're out there admiring some pollinators, visiting plants. But you do have to take it kind of with a grain of salt because it's not going to work for you all of the time. So these two pictures show non-hairy bees that don't carry their wings in the typical bee-like fashion when they're in flight, and but they're very true bona fide bees. And then here are two examples of extra clever flies. The top is a hoverfly that actually has lengthened its club-like antennae to the dimension of sausage links and has cleverly folded its wings across its back. So even if you get super close, it's really difficult for you to count how many pairs there are. On the bottom, well, that's a giveaway because this is a predatory insect with a poor victim in its mouth parts. But this is a bumblebee mimicking robber fly, and of course, being mimicking a bumblebee means that it doesn't fall into the target of many of the predators that would eat insects, but generally avoid bumblebees for their painful stings. So if you're out there learning how to distinguish pollinators, oftentimes this involves quite a bit of what am I looking at, which I think really adds to the fun and the challenge of being a nature enthusiast. And there's a lot of what am I looking at when it comes to the world of bees. So here are just 16 pictures of native bees, most of which you can find right in the confines of San Diego. So here in North America, we have 4,000 species of bees, give or take. Around the world, the number goes up to 20,000 species. And as you can see, they come in all shapes and sizes and colors, which hints at the fact that a healthy ecosystem needs all these different kinds of bee species in order to function properly. which is why it's a problem that in many areas of the world, bees are disappearing from the landscape. Not all at once, not in huge numbers, but certainly declining bit by bit due to the actions of us humans. And one of the main causes of this disappearance of the bees is us humans taking habitat that looks like this, that is highly nurturing to all forms of life that live on this planet, into habitats that look like this, which are very nurturing to this kind of creature with two thumbs, um, and a great capacity to build very comfy places for us to live, but a landscape that really is not that friendly for organisms other than those that like to follow in the footsteps of humans, like pigeons, like mice, like cockroaches, or habitats that look like this, that are super nurturing for the plants that we love to eat. In this case, this is a pumpkin farm. These landscapes, now they do support life. They're not completely lifeless, but they do have many fewer species because of the intense simplification of the food webs, and also because of the change in both the biotic and the abiotic, the natural physical conditions of the landscape. So as you can imagine, many fewer bees are found in cities and in highly agriculturalized landscapes. Now, while habitat loss has historically been the biggest challenge for biodiversity conservation of all sorts of organisms worldwide, I think climate change is really starting to catch up with habitat loss. And these two things can act in conjunction with one another. So going back to my good old dissertation days at UC San Diego, this is one of my habitat fragment study sites on the top of the hill of Pasatiempo Avenue. This is what the habitat looks like. Pretty healthy scrub habitat in a year with typical rainfall. Typical from a historic perspective. I don't know if there's such a thing as typical rainfall in San Diego anymore these days. And this is the same study site during one of the worst drought years, which of course fell squarely within my dissertation, which luckily gave me sufficient time to partner with Scott and the others at the library to curate this bee collection, because I didn't need to spend all my time out in the field, because when there's nothing in bloom, there's not a lot of bees out there flying either. So as you can imagine, if we have several years of these extreme droughts, where plants are not blooming, bees that depend on these plants blooming can suffer as well. We can also have heat waves. We can have cold snaps. We can have unseasonable frost events. Here in Oklahoma, one of the things that I've become very interested in are these winter heat waves. So we don't think of heat waves as occurring in the winter, but these do happen. We have some. We had a string of days in January and February where it got warm enough for pollinators to actually break out of their suspended animation and start flying around looking for food. And they were months, if not weeks, if not months too early to find the foods that they would depend on. And, very few people have actually looked at what this means for the perspective of the entire pollinator community. Thankfully, what we found is that relatively few bees actually got tricked by these false springs, these winter heat waves, and came out. But we don't know how these events, especially as they become more and more exacerbated with climate change, are going to impact bees and plants and their interactions with one another. And believe it or not, conflicts with invasive species or non-native species like the Western honeybee, which is a native to Europe and Africa, these could be threats to native pollinators as well. So the honeybee is a beautiful and lovely insect when used responsibly. Here in San Diego, there's a long history of these bees just running feral, and setting up shop outside of their interactions with us humans. And researchers elsewhere have made the estimate that a single healthy colony of honeybees can take so many resources from the environment that in a growing season of 3 months, the colony can take so much resources that would otherwise have made 100,000 average native pollinators. So just imagine how much resources are not being converted to native bees when a non-native species like the honeybee is eating their lunch. And the honeybee is not the only non-native species that we have to be careful of. Here in California, there are many ecosystems that have been taken over by invasive grasses. Now, grasses do bloom, but they're wind pollinated, so they don't make flowers with nectar that bees are able to use to nourish their offspring. So invasion by plants can also be bad for bees as well. So earlier I showed this animation showing a bunch of bees disappearing. And I did also mention that, it's not a doom and gloom scenario where like all the bees are disappearing everywhere. It's rather the case that in many places, especially those that are most heavily impacted by human impacts, we're starting to lose species one by one, and populations are starting to drop bit by bit. So there are some species left, and there's still a lot of hope. And as a scientific community, and I think as a human race, it's important for us to know which species are being lost and why, so that we can start to slow down and reverse these patterns. Well, to start addressing the question of which species and why, we first must understand how native bees live their lives, because the unique natural histories of each of these species will often play a big role in how the species responds to environmental change brought on by us humans. So for the majority of bee species, their life cycle goes like this. I title this Trust Fund Baby. It's this slide, Trust Fund Babies, and you'll see why. Here's a female bee. She forages for pollen and nectar, and she excavates a tunnel underground where she makes a deposit of the pollen and nectar, and then puts an egg on it. And when the baby hatches, it is born on top of this giant comfy food pillow that contains all the nutrients it needs to grow up healthy and strong. And just like the slide intimates, these bees really they don't need to develop any life skills of their own because the mom has prepared all it needs to succeed in life. Once it eats this food pillow, it pupates, so it turns into a pupa, not unlike a butterfly chrysalis. So they go through complete metamorphosis, which means that all bees that you see out there in the wild with wings flying around, these are all adults, no matter how big or how small they are. And then when the time is right, the following year or later that same season, they come out and the process repeats itself again. So this pertains to female bees. In the meantime, the male bees, when they emerge, they don't work hard to excavate tunnels like females. They don't collect pollen and nectar. Really, they just fly around and chase females. So they are, in a very real sense, absentee dads, like almost all insects are, with just very few exceptions. It's always the moms that take care of the babies. But bees are absentee dads in an additional sense, which is in this entire order that also includes the wasps and the ants, the females hatch from fertilized eggs and males hatch from unfertilized eggs. So, so male bees are actually absentee dads in the sense that they're not even giving their genetic information to the sons of their spouses. So male bees never have a dad, but they always have a grandpa because mom needs a dad to be a mom. Anyway, moving on to the life history of bees. So we talked about bees as the majority of bee species as nesting in tunnels that they excavate underground. Many bee species, like this beautiful striped sweat bee, can excavate many different kinds of soil. If you have a garden, whether it's sandy or clayey or nutrient rich, it seems like if there's a little bit of exposed soil, they can dig a tunnel and be pretty happy with it. But there are other species that are much more picky, like this close cousin of the striped sweat bee, this little orange, beautiful bee, that really seems to require sandy soil in order to make its nest. And then there are those like this digger bee that strongly prefers steep clay banks that stay stable even when they tunnel into the sides of them. So it's important for us to consider retaining different kinds of geological features if we want to think about how best to protect all the different bee species that are found in an environment. Of the bees that don't tunnel in the soil, the majority of the remainder nest in cavities above the ground. Some species, like this carpenter bee, can tunnel their own way into pretty solid wood, which sometimes make them pests, but they're also very admirable because they're excellent pollinators. They are very shrewd social organisms that have pretty intricate social lives with their siblings. And also for all you DIY enthusiasts, you can inspect this photograph of the inside of a carpenter bee nest, and you can see that it has made distinct rooms out of this nest that it has excavated. And the walls between the rooms, these are actually made of sawdust that she's excavated and collected and compacted together with some secretions. So, going back to the DIY enthusiast, you can thank the carpenter bee for having invented the world's first particle boards right here. And among the bees that can do some excavation in wood are also small carpenter bees. These are bees that can't tunnel through solid wood, but they can tunnel through the softer cores of dead stems and branches that are left in the field. So as you can imagine, if you keep a garden for the purpose of attracting pollinators, but then you cut down all the dead stems year after year, it's going to be difficult for these small carpenter bees to make their homes. So the different bees that use different kinds of structures and geological formations to make their nests, we need to consider these nesting requirements. Another big portion of bees that nest above the ground nest in pre-existing cavities that are left behind by beetles. You can see one that humans have drilled on the left that mimic beetle emergence holes, and on the right, this is a mud dauber wasp nest that mud dauber wasps have made, and then their offspring have emerged, leaving holes behind for this mason bee to then make their nest. Going back to the picture on the left, this is a cross-section of the nest, and because these bees are not making their own homes, but rather renting pre-existing space that are just kind of vacant in the environment, they have less control over what the conditions are like inside, so they have to bring in their own furniture. So you can see on the top, these are nest cells that are made with resin. In the middle and bottom, you can see different species have cut variously plant leaves and also petals in order to wrap their babies and the pollen and nectar that they've deposited in there. So here's an example of a bee species that nests in the cavities. This is a bee that has very, very beautiful, large, elongated mandibles. And what this bee uses the mandibles for is actually not biting or chewing like most other insects with big jaws are for. For this bee, these mandibles are actually like the prongs of a forklift. What it does is it uses these mandibles to manipulate big wads of resin, and then just like a forklift, it picks those balls of resin up to fly home to make their nest. Okay, so that's nesting needs. Different native bee species also have different dietary needs. So all the bee pictures I've showed you up until now are bee species that are pretty unpicky. If there's flowers in the environment that have acceptable amounts of pollen and nectar, they'll go to those flowers. If they can manipulate the flower to get enough of the pollen, they're pretty happy to just take pollen from whatever. But a sizable minority of bees, somewhere in the order of 1/3 or so, averaged across the entire North American continent, a sizable fraction of these are pretty picky eaters. So here, this is a pretty specialized bee that are not found too far outside of the bounds of Southern California, the southwestern short-faced bee, and it'll only accept pollen from sunflower family members. And based on my experience with this bee, it really only goes to the yellow sunflower members. So if you've got a white one, I think generally speaking, they'll snub their nose at it. Here's another bee that's often seen in Southern California, the black-fronted turret bee, and it is a specialist of the Malvaceae family, which includes the hibiscus and mallows. This one seems to really, really prefer not poppy mallows, checker bloom mallows, like pictured here in particular. And then there are bees that are even more picky, where they will only go to a single species of plant. So this is a bee that I had documented here in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, we have a good half dozen or more species in the bergamot group. So the genus is Monarda. And among these, there's one called Monarda punctata, the spotted horseman. And this bee will only collect pollen from the spotted horseman. In my experience, I've looked at many other Monarda species and never found this bee collecting pollen from them. So super picky eaters. Um, so, we may think, yeah, okay, well, these picky eaters, what do they have to do with us, right? If they're just out there interacting with one plant species, how is that how is that significant? Well, if they're interacting with the right species that we care about, they can actually become very economically important, like this hoary squash bee that has actually spread all across North America from a SoCal, northern Mexico origin, because humans have been transporting cucurbita squashes, the same species as cultivated pumpkins and zucchinis, but Native Americans use them as containers for water and for other ceremonial uses. These gourds and wild squashes have been transported all throughout North America, and this bee has followed them. And even now, in in large pumpkin and zucchini fields, if you have this bee nesting nearby, this one species can pollinate the entire field before even the honeybees and bumblebees are up, well before sunrise. So they can be economically very important to us. And if you're that one plant species that the bee really depends on, that is a high quality interaction partner that you can really depend on. So the loss of even these really picky eaters could have large and wide-ranging ecological impacts as well. And there are also dietary needs of these bees that we're just starting to understand. So, for example, researchers recently found out that bees are not actually strict vegetarians. What their larvae are eating are not just straight pollen and straight nectar from plants, but rather in the time between when the pollen is collected and when the bee baby starts to eat it, the microbes that are in that pollen, either whether they're collected or secreted or brought on purpose by the parents or just kind of out there in the environment, they start to ferment and digest the pollen so that a lot of the very hard, inaccessible nutrients that are found in the pollen are actually liberated and released by these microbes. So when the bees are eating these pollen and nectar balls, they're not actually eating just just a straight, natural product. It's more like a value-added product, like a kimchi or a kombucha. And this also makes bees some of the earliest brewing organisms. And if you go into the nest of a cellophane bee, like the one pictured here, you'll see that their pollen and nectar, they're more soupy, and because those provisions are a little soupier, you can actually see them bubbling and you can smell the yeast fermenting the pollen and nectar balls. And what this means is that, when we spray chemicals in the environment, even those that have been tested specifically that they won't, kill a bee outright because they're targeting weedy plants or agriculturally important fungi, molds or something, they could actually be harming these microorganisms that bees need as symbiotes to digest the pollen and nectar mixture for them. So we're still finding out a lot of facts about even just the basic natural history of bees that are informing how our actions are impacting bees and the health of these important pollinators. Another key life history aspect to account for is the fact that some bees are social. So unlike the honeybee, which live in colonies of tens of thousands, most of our social bees live in colonies of dozens to hundreds. And this is not a super common life history characteristic. Something like 90% of the bees out there are solitary, like all the ones that I showed you earlier, but that still leaves 10% of bees that do live in these social colonies headed by a queen, and where all her daughters are workers, except for those that will become the queens in the next generation. And these bees, even though they are a lot less diverse, there are fewer species compared to the solitary bees, they often play an outsized ecological role. because they can reach such high numbers. So bumblebees are one group that has this social characteristic. So you can see here a bumblebee colony that's using a kind of human-made domicile where they've made balls of wax or chambers of wax, and they're storing little bits of nectar and pollen to raise their offspring. So this can be a very successful lifestyle. In many different places, bumblebees are the dominant pollinator. You go out, and that's the most obvious flying thing you'll see, because they can really scale up. A single queen can just focus on laying eggs, and all the workers can be bringing back pollen and nectar, and they do have some capacity to store some to keep the colony production at a steady pace. But just like any other multi-level marketing or pyramid scheme, it can be a pretty hard lifestyle, right? So every bumblebee queen actually starts out as a hardworking single mom, not unlike many participants in these multi-level marketing schemes. She has to emerge from the colony that she was born in. She has to fatten herself up by foraging for pollen and nectar. She has to find a safe spot to hibernate through the winter. She has to respond to the correct cues in the spring to then start foraging and replenishing her energy after a long winter of slumber. And then she has to find an appropriate nest site, make her first few wax chambers, raise those first few daughters, all the while foraging for herself, fending for herself, until she can finally have enough of a workforce that she can then retire back in the colony and let her daughters do the dangerous and hard work of foraging for pollen and nectar. So if you're successful and you do get to that stage after facing all those hardships, you can be wildly successful. But the fact is that the majority of queens never make it that far, just like to my understanding, the majority of people who strike out as entrepreneurs. And because of this complicated life history that have so many intricacies to it, a large portion of the bee species that are known to be endangered are bumblebees, like this Southern Plains bumblebee here that I have right here in Oklahoma that has been petitioned for federal listing. The last life history trait that I wanted to mention are that some bee species don't work hard to collect pollen and nectar and construct their own nests, but rather live as home intruders in the nests of other bees. So what they do is they will break and enter into the nest of a different bee species that does collect pollen and nectar in the honest, hardworking fashion. And the female of these kleptoparasitic bees will put their own egg in place of the host's egg. And either the mother parasite will eat the egg of the host, or the larval parasite, when they hatch, will eat or destroy the egg of the host, and then it will take over the pollen ball. So this lifestyle is kind of reminiscent of cuckoo birds or brown-headed cowbirds. So these bees are often called cuckoo bees, right? So you may think, wow, that's brilliant. You know, you don't have to work hard. Everybody else does the hard work, and you just go in and reap all the rewards. That's easy living. In some ways, that's true, but on the other hand, it also does limit you to being able to exist only where your host bee, the bees on whose hard work you are depending, where they're abundant. You're basically feeding at a higher trophic level, and your survival is entirely dependent on the survival and thriving of a different bee species. I like showing this particular picture of this cuckoo bee because, as you can see here, cuckoo bees, because they don't collect pollen and nectar, they don't carry nesting material or excavate nests. They've lost a lot of the cute, fuzzy, round features that make bees so adorable, and they kind of look much more sinister and waspy. Like this one's even like rubbing her hands like she's plotting something evil. Okay, so anyway, we talked a lot about the natural history of bees and how these natural histories are intricately tied to how well they can face a human-dominated and degraded landscape. Now, how do we go about slowing down or even reversing this process of losing bees from our environment? Well, I have a few recommendations. One is we can do our best to plant native plants in whatever habitat or whatever real estate we have access to in order to provide bees the best fighting chance. So here's an anecdote. I just recently heard this great word, anecdata. This is not real scientific data, but I think it's instructive nevertheless. I live in southeastern Norman, still well within the city limits, in what I guess could be considered the suburbs. There's not a ton of natural habitat near me. It's not pristine land. It's all been degraded by grazing and other and agriculture and stuff. In my first year at the house, the whole plot was just a raised, flat, graded piece of land. I started growing sunflowers in order to try to provide some food for native pollinators. The second year I grew sunflowers, this bee showed up. This is the robust sunflower leafcutter, and it's a bee that has been ranked G2 by NatureServe, which means that conservation biologists have deemed this bee to be quite threatened, and there seem to be relatively few populations of this bee left. Sorry, I pressed the button by accident. So the fact that this rare and endangered bee showed up in my backyard tells us two things. So one, we still have a lot to learn about what causes any given bee species to be endangered, because sunflower, which is the plant that this bee depends on, is literally one of the most common flowers across the entire North America. It grows abundantly in every state except Alaska and Hawaii. So why is it that a bee that depends on such a common food source has become endangered? There's a lot more to learn. So that's number one. Number two is if you grow native plants and devote some of your real estate to helping the bees, you never know when you're going to be able to help out a threatened species to keep a toehold in your neighborhood and prevent it from becoming locally extinct. The second is to save the right bees. So I'm not anti-honeybee. I have a lot of respect for honeybees. Here's me working as an apiarist during my postdoc. But we really need conservation efforts to go to saving the right species, right? So if I show up today and I have a shirt on that says save the herd, and there's a picture of a bison herd on my shirt, immediately you know I'm a conservation biologist who cares about large mammals of the American Great Plains, right? If I walk in here instead and I have this shirt that says "Save the Herds," and it's a herd of dairy cattle, you know that I'm an animal rights activist who cares about how animals under our management are being handled by this mega industrial agricultural, animal husbandry complex, right? So it should be the same for bees. The honeybee is a super important animal, arguably the economically most important insect in the world. And human modern agriculture is very difficult to now separate from contributions of the honeybee. But at the end of the day, this is an animal husbandry issue, an animal rights issue, making sure that we manage the honeybee appropriately and we do right by them, that we don't keep poisoning these creatures that we're bringing in to do the hard labor for us. But that's a different issue compared to the existential threats that many native bees are facing. And I think it helps everybody when the populace, when the general public is well educated about which one is a conservation issue and which one is an animal husbandry and food security issue. Thankfully now, when you search Save the Bees, you will see a lot more, still not a lot, but a lot more than before, a lot more pleas and requests for people to put their attention and their conservation dollars on the actual conservation issues of native bees rather than the animal husbandry issue of honeybees, which of course, again, are also very important. Another tip that I'd like to mention is the use it or lose it idea. So we have thankfully still a lot of natural habitat left in many parts of North America. We are a continent that is comparably sparsely populated, but a lot of this land has no certain future. I think even places that are designated parks and conservation lands may not exist as such in perpetuity if there's no evidence that people are enjoying the inherent benefits that they bring. So go out to your national parks, to your state parks, to your local nature trails, show the people who manage these properties that people are using them and appreciating them for what they are. Vote with your feet, vote with your dollars, get that state park pass. You can also help by filling in gaps by photographing bees and uploading them to this community science platform called iNaturalist, which can help biologists to track bee populations in ways that we really could never have done in the past before. So as you may guess, there's only a handful of biologists in any given city or state that's trained to monitor bees. And we can't be doing this every single day and be everywhere at once and get permission to simultaneously be at all the different parcels of land that belong to many different land managers. But if members of the public can take photos of bees whenever you encounter them, these records can really help us to figure out which bees are well, you can upload them. Which bees are flying at what times, at what place. And when you upload these pictures to iNaturalist, invariably at some point, some expert comes by and tells you what they are. So there's the added benefit. If you join this enterprise of community science, you get the satisfaction of being able to figure out what it is that you encountered on that flower in your yard. And if you're wondering just how valuable iNaturalist data can be, here's some unpublished data that we're still working on. We found that iNaturalist contributes a huge portion of the total bee data that are coming in the last 20 years. So the shading of these cells indicate what percent of the data come from iNaturalist versus from museum records, which is in the past the only way really we could ascertain population trends in bees. So these are data from the last 20 years. And as you can see, there are a lot of grid cells, a lot of localities in the US where iNaturalist data, these data from photographs far outstrip what data we have from museum collections and other formal scientific studies. In part, that's because iNaturalist really has been capturing the heart of the public, and people really are going out and photographing a lot of bees. But also in part, this reflects the significant delays in the specimen processing and identification and digitization process of those species, of those specimens that have already been captured and documented by biologists. It just takes a long time for them to become publicly usable data. In contrast, iNaturalist data are born digital. They start as digital photographs. So there's basically no lag time as soon as you upload the photo onto iNaturalist. So this means that for biologists who want to see what's happening to bees in real time, we really need these community science data sources to fill in important gaps. And this is really not just lip service. This is not just scientists, saying, oh, you can contribute important data and just using this as an excuse to get people to buy in to the enterprise. We really are taking these data very seriously in our academic research. So here, for example, is a paper that really was born out of a close partnership between nature enthusiasts who are committed to documenting biodiversity in their neighborhoods and scientists who care a lot about all the organisms that people are seeing and value the input from these scientists. So we were able to document the incursion of a rare, or not rare, but of an unusual island bee that really shouldn't be found on the mainland, but somehow made its way to Cabrillo National Monument. And this was published last year. And on top of being a great source of data, there are also some advantages of iNaturalist data. So for example, here is a Texas nocturnal sweat bee, and it's perched on a prairie sunflower. So for this bee, we know that the females only collect pollen from evening primroses, but after the females go to sleep and the males have no one to chase around and can finally take a rest and fuel themselves up, we know very little about what the males are doing. So through this picture, we know, hey, males like to nectar at least at prairie sunflower. So that's an important species to keep around if we want both the male and female bees of this rare species to be provided for. And really also with this picture, not only do you have the bee and what it's doing, you also have this bee that after being photographed is able to go on and continue doing its thing rather than being collected and taking up space on a pin inside a museum, which of course these are important things to do, but at the scale at which we are needing bee data, I just love that these bees that have become scientific data are able to keep doing their thing and live out the rest of their lives. So I'm really, really hoping that this catches on more and more data can come from this kind of source. I also think everybody wins when local communities of informed and engaged humans can be empowered to better monitor and steward and conserve and be involved in the conservation of their own precious ecological resources right where they live. And lastly, a wise man once said that we only protect what we love and we only love what we know. So these are my kids, and as often as I can, I take them out. This is Christian with a jar of butterflies and Gracie. This is a year ago now, so they're a little bit bigger and a little bit more well-versed in entomology. I take them out to the field whenever I can so that they're rubbing shoulders with these organisms so that biological conservation to them isn't just some noble idea floating out somewhere, but really the targets of conservation are these species that they know and they love from personal experience. So hopefully, as we continue to do this with our own children and our friends, we can leave a world where our grandchildren's grandchildren can continue to go outdoors like we do and enjoy beautiful ecosystems in their natural state, including, of course, our amazing native bees. With that, I would like to thank all the people and entities and funding agencies that have made my research and education efforts possible over the years. And I'd love to thank you for being here, making this a special 10-year anniversary event for us. And I hope I have time to take a few questions. Oh, and you can also contact me there at my email address if you have anything that, in addition, that you want to talk about.
Thank you, James. Yes, I'm sure people will take advantage of that. Yeah, we do have time for a couple questions, and we some of these questions will actually have you answer online later. But there were
Yes.
a couple interesting ones that we may as well do because there was some time. People were kind of taken aback when you were mentioning a statistic about how many native pollinators are suffering because of honeybees. They were even saying, what was that statistic again?
Yeah, so this is according to research by some USDA biologists, and their estimate based on how much pollen and nectar is brought back to a typical honeybee colony is that each month a honeybee colony can take in as much resources as something like 33,000 pollinators, a native bees would take, right? So over the course of a 3-month growing season, which is a pretty typical amount of time that beekeepers might leave their bee yards out in some natural landscape for them to kind of do free range foraging. Over the course of 3 months, that's 100,000 native bees per hive that they put there. So that's a pretty large number. Of course, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. These are just numbers, these that are estimates, but I think it's probably in the right ballpark in terms of how much resources is being stripped.
Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah, most of the questions were along those lines, and we'll have you answer some of them more directly.
Mhm.
Certainly, there was one interesting one as far as a question as far as bee species that are proposed to be listed.
Mhm.
Uh, person asked, "Is there a size bias? Is that why bumblebees are often candidates?"
I think there absolutely can be a size bias. So, bumblebees are large and fuzzy and charismatic, and um, both bee experts and amateur entomologists from kind of all ages have been collecting them. So we have pretty robust records of bumblebees going back centuries here in North America. Um, in contrast, many of the smaller, more obscure bee species are maybe too small to be noticed by the average insect enthusiast. So a lot of our old specimens come from students, come from amateur entomologists, come from entomology professors who are not specifically experts in a narrow set of bees, right? So if they're out there just kind of chasing all insects, trying to get a really good picture of just the overall insect biodiversity in their region, I think it's very easy to imagine how bumblebees that are large and slow and showy could be overrepresented in their collection, and they may have missed some of the very small, maybe more specialized bees that fly at odd times of the year or are difficult to see by the naked eye when you're out, with lots and lots of distractions. So I think that's where the size bias comes in. Um, but um, but I think more and more people are recognizing that, there are other bees than bumblebees that have life histories that predispose them to being threatened. So actually, of the species that are actually listed on the Endangered Species Act, currently I think only one or two are bumblebees. The rest of the bees are actually these small, very nondescript masked bees that are endemic to Hawaii. So there are some smaller bees that are represented as well because that group is well known, and the threats to their existence are very well documented, in these very, very small and very threatened ecosystems in Hawaii.
Yeah, those specimen cases that you donated to the library 10 years ago, some of the specimens are so tiny, so tiny,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
others so spectacularly Zoftig. It's just amazing the difference. And I can see why that person was asking that. Now, there is one person was quite intrigued with uh, uh, you're talking about honeybees and still worried about how much resources they can take away. But there's one listener, viewer, who has a couple of acres of property in Escondido, and they'd like to add some honeybee boxes. And where should they go to? How should they pursue that?
That's a good question. So honeybees are, super prevalent all over San Diego. Um, there are people who trap wild swarms, but research um, through UC San Diego, actually, in the labs of one of my mentors, um, they found that there's a fair amount of the Scutellata hybrid um, gene, or the Scutellata gene, which is a race of honeybees from Africa, and that group is they're they tend to make smaller colonies that are more mobile, and that there's a reputation for them being more aggressive. So I would say if you're a novice beekeeper, don't catch a wild swarm, just because you may not know what you're dealing with. There's no way to know unless you do the genetics on them. Probably if you want to keep honeybees, um, get get your starter colonies from a reputable source. And I would say, you know, at this point, you're probably not going to unleash any ecological disasters that are not already taking place because honeybees are already everywhere in the county. Your colonies are just going to be a drop in the bucket. But still, if you find that your colonies are short on pollen and nectar, especially during certain times of the year, to the point where you need to feed them to keep them alive. If your bees are hungry, those bees out there, the native bees, likely are hungry as well. So if you find that you are you're having to supplement your honeybees, which are amazing, efficient foraging machines. How can the native bees compete? So if that's what's happening, A, maybe have fewer colonies, and B, maybe think about amending your landscape, planting plant species that specifically bloom during those times when your honeybee colonies are extra hungry, so that they have something to eat. You don't have to feed them sugar water, which is not great for them, and also that they would go to the plants that you provide for them instead of flying everywhere else and competing for the already limited resources with the native pollinators that are there first.
Thank you so much, James. And we'll answer some of these other questions online. And we meeting you, and we so appreciate it. So
Yeah,
appreciate it.
happy to
But
do
there's
that.
some here that we can answer too, based they're just asking some repeats of some of the statistics, and we can help with that. But
Okay,
I know
perfect.
that you want to check on your children to make sure they really went to bed. So we
We're a
probably should
couple hours
go.
ahead here.
Yeah, and so we wish you could visit us on World Bee Day, because we've got your specimen cases. We're still so proud of what good shape they're in, and one of your colleagues is going to be doing a lecture that's not recorded, a live only lecture.
That's right.
Yeah,
Anyone who's in San Diego, I highly recommend Jess Mullen's presentation that's coming up. She's doing it on World Bee Day. Is that right?
on actual World Bee Day,
On actual World Bee Day.
and we're
Yeah.
giving away some honey samples if it's okay with everyone. And we're even dedicating a special madrigal for her. There was a Charles Butler, a Renaissance beekeeper and also musician, wrote this spectacular short little madrigal about bees, and we're going to perform that for her. We're doing the 3-minute version of that, and we'll send you a recording of that, because we're very proud to be able to present that to her, a musical overture before her talk.
That sounds like such a great time.
And she sends her regards, by the way, and we're looking forward to telling you how all that went.
Yeah.
So thanks again. We really appreciate it. We hope to see you back here at UC San Diego sometime soon. I'm sure your kids would love to visit. Well,
Yes.
your children wasn't really even born yet, I think, but
Well, my son was born in San Diego, and he has hazy memories of there, but my daughter has never been, so it's gonna be a great treat for her. So she was born in Toronto and then moved to Oklahoma. She's never seen the ocean,
oh
so
my.
so we need to get her there. Yeah.
Well, we'll be ready for her. We
Uh-huh.
look forward to meeting her. Thanks again, and
Yeah.
good
Thank
luck.
you for having me.
Oh, such a pleasure, and good luck in Oklahoma.
Thank you. I'm gonna need it. All right. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.